Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research and education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracey A. Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research Practice Podcast. Today we have the opportunity to talk with esteemed scholar Dr. Hilary Green about her new book, Unforgettable Sacrifice: How Black Communities Remembered the Civil War, and her work on 19th century U.S. history. Dr. Green is a James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have so much to talk about today. So let's just start off with, folks getting to know you. So who are you and how did you get into this work in the first place?
So I am a 19th century U.S. historian. And for me, how I got into this book, but also my overall research, is through family history. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. My mom's side of the family is from South Central Pennsylvania, and they were free people of color before the Civil War. My dad's side of the family are Gullah Geechee from South Carolina, and they were enslaved during the war. And I was born in Boston, where the Massachusetts 54th and 55th Regiment. So for me, family history and the Civil War allowed me to link both sides of my family and understand my place in the world as someone these roots on both sides of the conflict in different ways, and the impact affected both sides differently, and it shaped me who I was as a person. And that's how I got into the Civil War in 19th century U.S. history.
Wonderful, wonderful. It sounds like a close personal significance to you yourself and your lineage and your who your ancestors are. And thinking about the intervention that you're seeking to make in the field, because I think your work is, ahead of its time. What we actually need, what a lot of the College Board is trying to do,
Yep.
right, in a semi not successful way. But what is the importance of your intervention if you had to describe it to folks?
One of the things I want to introduce is the role of the African American porch as an archival space. And that's one of the things for me. I was reading these histories about the Civil War and Civil War memory, and they were like, oh, but we know everything. I'm like, but you haven't talked about this community. You haven't talked about civilian trauma that I heard. And all these stories I grew up listening to. And then as I worked at the University of Alabama, Elizabeth City State University, and even Davidson, I was listening to other Black communities' voice experiences from their porches. And they would pull out their scrapbooks and other things like that. And I'm like, we haven't even touched this part of what the war meant, how it got remembered. And it's not a victimization narrative. These are people who just preserved in their own way what their families and communities meant for the next generation and 2 generations down. Had nothing to do with countering lost cause or anything else. They just wanted to make sure that their history was accounted for.
And so for someone who's not even remotely, in terms of social distance, like say you're like some rich white family in the suburbs who has, of course, everyone has a connection to the Civil War, right? In America's history, but like, why should they care about, previous enslaved, Africans who are telling their stories? Like, why should they care at all?
And I think that's one of the things about caring about and why centering around the porch. We all have porches. We've all sat down on the porch and heard our family histories and our community histories. These porches, though, are different because in the case of my family, I talk about my Civil War ancestor who served in the war and how his daughters and then my grandmother talked about the Civil War in different ways and what we were supposed to do in the community and how we were a practice of parenting. And also just gave us little nuggets about self-assurance and reassure where we were going and how our family had intervened in the larger American project. So that porch sitting, the role of women, parenting, who tells the history or not. And so one for me, I look at the word kinkeeper. Those who are your kin, whether they embrace you as kin and family or they embrace you as a community, they see you as someone to know this history so you become a healthier, more self-adjusted adult. And I think that gap in what's not taught in the schools versus what's taught locally in the community, how to bridge that is so important for this book and the intervention I'm making. And it can apply to any other communities. It just happens in this case, I'm dealing with the Civil War and Black communities who have been largely ignored. But what other porch lessons and stories have we heard that we are not including in our canon? And how do we bring that in to tell a more accurate and truthful history of our past rather than what those who have money and access can tell us what our past should be?
Ooh, let's get into that. Accurate and truthful, right? Because that's a moving target on what you consider to be. I mean, because history is interpreted,
Yeah.
from those who study it today. And so
Mhm.
when you say more accurate and truthful,
Mhm.
how are you thinking about that?
One of the things I'm very key on and why I organized the book the way I did was these were the stories that were left out. And that being left out wasn't just haphazard, it was intentional to leave out the stories of African American soldiers who served in the Civil War. They're just non-existent in some of these histories. They only come in like glory, they come in a few other places, but a lot of my ancestors who served in the war enlisted out of Philadelphia. And they served in the US colored troops, the 22nd, 24th, and others. And I'm like, we haven't even talked about one of the largest places of Black enlistment was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And all of those regiments that contributed to the Civil War, because we only focus on the exceptional. And the 54th Massachusetts, the Louisiana Native Guard are the exceptional regiments because they're early, but that's not the common experience. And so for me to talk about what happens when these men come home, and their communities embrace them, and then the rest of society only focus on a few, where does their histories fall into there? Where does their regiment experience fall out of? And that's why I think it's important because the 22nd USCT that comes out of Philly, where my ancestor I write about in the book comes in, they enter Richmond in April 1865. They are the conquering army. And they get described, but never who those men were and what happened afterwards. So we get them frozen in time as if that's the only thing they did, and not what they did when they came home and how they remembered. So I think about those silences, intentionality, whose story got told, whose story didn't. And oftentimes it's the role of race and class and other gender and the things that don't neatly fit a progress narrative of success, where it's haphazard and forgetting a lot of violence. And I think that's where I want to bring those stories back to the fore and those experiences back into the narrative so we can have a more honest conversation of what it meant. And for these communities, what did that service mean when then the nation tells them to forget that past and accept the white narrative that white men came together and brothers in arms, but there's no place for African Americans in that narrative.
Wow. I mean, I can't read I haven't read it yet. I am going to absolutely cover to cover and leave a review on Amazon. So I'm sure it's hot fire. And so you talked about the purposefulness of erasing that history.
Mhm.
Now, just to break it down, because there's the intervention with the College Board. I mean, I have my opinions on their, AP African American history and sort of how that was rolled out and what the sort of
Mm,
the how it became sort of an easy target for
mhm.
folks to work against because the College Board has, I think, 7 or 8 history offerings,
Nope.
right? And they put this sort of hanging chad out there, and like this is the one, right? But all the other ones were sort of left intact. So if you're thinking about how to better integrate what's in, or do you think it has to stay separate? Like,
Mm.
does this history have to stay separate from sort of the whitewashed history over here, or should it be integrated in a different way? And teachers are like, well, I only have 180 days in my curriculum. So how do we reconcile that?
I think there should be aspects incorporated from the African American studies one into U.S. history and all the histories, and actually all the subjects of AP, because it's interdisciplinary. And so for me, I'm okay with it being separate for the reason that, like the porch that I talk about, that's not a straight linear narrative. I look at music, I look at foodways, what are they doing in parades? How are they creating the muscle and mental memory muscle to remember this past? So people would break out into song and then tell me their story. And I'm like, what are those cues in their mind? And I'm not sure how that can be captured in the traditional AP US history, but in the Afghan studies one can, because it's that you're thinking about everything together and the whole person. And the other thing I think would be great is the project. I can see someone looking at what does the porch of the Civil War look like in my community if I focus on my own family history or my community's history. And right now, the US history ones, the other ones don't have that, paper and project aspect, so they can read my primary sources and put that into the exam. Real easy. It can be on a DBQ. Really, really easy. But how do you get students thinking about researching their own community histories and finding for themselves those interventions in unique ways that's not just a traditional source, but oral history, quilted, material culture in a way that get that texture into the project itself, including monuments, like the physical memorial, the headstones of soldiers. How does that fit in? And I think that's one way the African American studies having them both. Now, I would say, if anything, you need a sequence in. You need to take the US history and all the other histories first before you can successfully take the Afghan studies course. Because if you don't know this history or know a baseline, you will have no understanding of how what is different with the other, what kind of voices, and understanding the context behind those voices in a way. And that's something I'm not sure what we can do sequencing and getting it earlier. But right now, if you don't have that, I'm concerned that you won't be as successful to even engage with a project. But we need both courses. So I say it's not an either or, but an and. We need both though at the same time.
Yeah, I want to relate that to personal experience, but first, I want to sort of let's go there. Let's go there because as far as my history goes, I was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, very wide area. There are a lot of Black folks there still. After the second grade, I was bused out to a suburban school for my third grade through 12th grade. And the history classes were just like very boring to me. I was not interested because it's just a white man's history course, right? We
Yeah.
showed up during slavery and during civil rights, right? That's where we showed up. And when we talked about any other population, we might have talked about Japanese internment and Native American genocide, but not in those terms, right? So it was a very, very white history. And I remember I didn't take my first Africana course until my junior year in college. It was it's something like intervention of African and African American women in the U.S. history. And I was just floored about how much different the pedagogy
Oh,
was
yeah.
than the traditional history courses I'd taken because I was not interested at all in K-12. And so what I hear you saying, this not an either or, it's a both and. And I also want to think about because it could be it's like a cold bucket of water if you take AP African American history 12th grade and then you're like, wait, I've been missing this all along. And so when we're thinking about a curriculum prior to, AP, because not everyone's going to reach that, and most schools still don't offer it. We were thinking about more of the middle school age, 6 through 12. Like, how do we introduce the frame of looking at history through a lens that's more holistic rather than waiting for AP US history?
And this is one of the reasons why this book is framed the way it was. My parents and my community members did a great job in making sure that I just didn't have the traditional history books. So I remember in third grade, I was reading about the US history class, and they said Reconstruction was a mistake. And because African Americans got rights too quickly, and I was like, "What's a mistake about this? This side served in the war and they fought. They saved the Union. This side got liberated. What's liberation of 4 million people? How's that a mistake?" And then my parents would take us to all the museums. We watched Eyes on the Prize. Like, they did a whole holistic independent movement that I could tell what was missing. So I became that student, but knew how to get the other information that my textbooks didn't have. So I think we should go back to more communal schools and not relying on the other part. But one of the things my parents did, documentaries. PBS was my best friend. And growing up outside of Boston, like, we had 3 PBSs: Rhode Island, Boston, and New Hampshire. So we had all the stations. So watching that was great. The other, we had museums. So when we would come down twice a year, to visit family in South Carolina, and then visit family in Pennsylvania. My parents took us to all the local museums and showed us their world and where they grew up. And my dad growing up Gullah Geechee on James Island, South Carolina, where harvest fields, we're in the fields. My dad's like, "This is how you pick peanuts. This is how you doing that." That other education helped so much more. But I so for me, how do you bring in those experiences? So if anything, 6th through 8th grade field trips still matter because our museums have been updated. Put in money for after school programs or freedom schools or different things like that. And then the other, probably bringing in some of those community historians into the classroom that I was able to get even in my school in Massachusetts, people who were reenactors in the 54, a gentleman who was the descendant of William Carney, who gets a Medal of Honor during the Civil War. He was active in telling his family history and came to the schools. So things like that, I think, is another way to introduce that you're not relying on the textbook alone and the inexperience of the teaching, but you get more of that community schooling that's in the classroom, but also outside the classroom. And that would be great. And then the last thing is people like me who write these books and other scholars, we need to start thinking about how do we tailor? Do we need a young adult version of our books? What is the age appropriate version of our books? And I'm seeing more and more of that. And I think we need to be more actively engaged that we get age appropriate versions of our books into those libraries, into those classrooms, that we're not overwhelming and giving them the appetite so they're not in college where most of my students learn about African American history for the first time. So it's college.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. Like, at least it's there, right?
Mhm.
At least it's accessible. It wasn't a requirement in sociology when I was there. I chose as an elective, just
Mhm.
happened to be able to take that course.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I can sort of join with you around the importance of parents, right? My parents, I didn't understand at the time why we were watching Roots, why we were watching other documentaries, why we were going to there was an African American Holocaust museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the hood. We would go there, right? And Black events. They wanted to make sure that they were countering the whitewashing of our traditional education
Mhm.
with something that was closer to our history,
Yeah.
right? And so I think the importance of our community educating ourselves is very important, and not just as you say, reliant on the sort of the typical canon that, is changing, but changing at a snail's pace.
Yeah, and I think you got the experience of the porch too, but in a different way. So one of the things is in a city, people like, we need to call it that, the stoop. We didn't have a porch, but we had a stoop. We had that backyard. We had, but it was that same impulse. We're gonna train the next generation so they're becoming the self-assured adults by telling them all the complexities, not just the bad things, but the positive, the setbacks, and the realistic things. And I think in many ways, that's one of the other takeaways of my book is these were people who came out of nothing but knew the importance of sharing their past in a holistic way and raising the next generation. They understood the violences that they would encounter as adults. And in a way, Civil War memory became a style of personal politics, but parenting politics and community building in very interesting ways I think still persists because they just added more wars, more context, but that impulse remains the same in so many instances.
So I know a little bit about some of the other work that you've done, right,
Yes.
at Alabama and
Mhm.
at Davidson around helping them locate their connection to their past connection to slavery. Now, what is the significance of that?
One of the things I think in all the work that I do is I emphasize ordinary people, and especially African American men, women, and children. These were people who lived, people who shaped and moved in the same spaces I did. And on college campuses, they are the other founders. Without their labor, without their contributions, there are no schools like the University of Alabama. There are no buildings at Davidson College. This was the labor that helped things going that we can enjoy today. And one of the things I'm also mindful of is the landscapes that they worked on are some of the same landscapes I walk on and I
Mm.
see every day. So that recognition of who are these people who shaped this space that I can be here as a professor. When they were here, all they could be is and owned by the college, leased by the college and university. and just in the classroom as the background. Whose shoulders am I standing on? And these are people. So, what are their names? What were their experiences? Who are their family? And what did they do specifically? And if we're going to talk about our institutional presidents and leaders and who were also enslavers and of people who settler colonialists in many ways, because we're on campuses that are on indigenous land and dispossession is a part of these histories too. That who made this space and who navigate the space that we can talk about going from slavery to the present in a very meaningful way. But more importantly, I'm interested in who are the men and women who made this possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could say that about a large portion of the U.S. economic infrastructure was
Yeah.
built on the backs of stolen Africans, right?
Mhm.
Without their labor, forced labor, we
Mhm.
would not be where we are today in the majority part, the major part of how we are as an infrastructure. And so what is the responsibility then? So is it simply acknowledgement, putting a plaque here or, creating a scholarship in someone's name? Because folks think about this, right? We're a very prestigious university, college or university. We're built on the backs of these slaves that we've erased, and now that we've sort of surfaced their contributions in our reliance on their labor, how do we appropriately atone for that?
One of the things that I really think about is also the structures of higher ed. For a lot of, we had legacy missions forever. Those who are employees of colleges and universities, their children in themselves can get an education. We haven't extended that to our previous workers. We give it to some of our workers, but not all. So I'm like, what are the practices that we need to expand? The other thing is retirement benefits. Not just enslavement, but the Jim Crow legacies and the persistence of those racial logics that continued all the way through to today, because some of these people are still the lowest paid individuals who are the janitors, the grounds people, and they work here, but they can't come to school here because they can't afford to set their children here. Or the schools that they're in are not positioned so they can come here, but it's okay for them to labor here. So one of the things I think about is current employment practices and pay and equity on there. Do they have retirement benefits? What happens to them? Can their children come here? So I think about current day practices, so not just giving a scholarship, giving there, but what are current day practices that we're not continuing extracting labor and exploiting labor from the past? That's one. The other I'm really thinking about is truth. Like in order to establish the truth, and one of the things is the hiddenness of the we don't know. I hear that a lot. We don't know who these people are. I'm
Mm.
like, have you tried to find it though?
Yeah.
So it's that hiding behind the archive as we can't find people. And in doing my projects at both at Alabama and at Davidson, people like, we're not sure if you're gonna find anyone. I'm like, oh no, I will find people. Once I find the people who they are, now what are we gonna do? And so the goal is to really atone in many ways, and I think scholarships is one for those who qualify because we did have a legacy of missions that excluded others, and we need to bring that back in. Current day labor issues with these spaces, and putting up a plaque and a monument is the easiest thing
Mm.
schools can do. It's the rest that's the hardest part, and so start having truthful conversations of how we use this past and make a better and healthier future, rather than saying, "Oh, that's in the past and we don't have to deal with it anymore." So my goal is not to unveil this history to say, "We did pat ourselves on the back and we're good." It's like, "Okay, how do we change the culture and our current day practices once we know this history and not do that again?"
Wow. No, that's really revolutionary, right? I've never heard that before
Mhm.
because I'm just thinking, so I came back, I think I was at this private school, like really highfalutin K-12 school, fancy. And they had been around since the 1800s, right? This particular campus is beautiful. And one of the benefits is if you teach there, your child can go there.
Mhm.
But I'm not thinking about all the folks who work there. It's not extended to them, right?
Yep.
It's only if you teach there, if you're one of the prestigious teachers or administrators. But yet there's equal amount of staff who are who are the school is very dependent on them for the school to run. Those who clean up, those who fix things, those who work in the front offices, classroom aides, and these positions are often occupied by folks who are descendants of slaves. And so thinking about that, oh my goodness, that's really revolutionary in a way that I think would be a threat to the privilege and power that the elites have.
Because education was used to create power hierarchies, and doing this history, you can see it with the anti-literacy laws of North Carolina, Alabama, but these individuals are in the classroom. They are literate. They can read the books because they're in the libraries. They're working in the labs with the professors, but yet they can't get a degree, and then their economic earning power got stifled by that. So the role education has been to create hierarchy, and I think equalizing that, they're like, "Oh, no, everyone who works there has access to" and trying to level out, and I think that's one way colleges and universities can really atone for that past because African Americans, weren't allowed to be students. And in fact, some campuses, like the University of Alabama and even Davidson, accepted during the Jim Crow era students from the Middle East, so non-white students from the Middle East, Japan, China, before they even admitted a student from Africa or the United States of, African descent. So we can have people from Japan, but we can't have African Americans, and that's in the history too. It goes back to education as that hierarchy and power differential. So if we level out that and give access based on labor at the workplace, as a benefit, I think we might do something better for colleges to atone for.
So has this
Mhm.
materialized anywhere as of yet, or is it still like you're still out there sort of beating the drum?
Well, I think this is what growing up in Massachusetts was a benefit. Boston College has a really good program, and in fact, it was in the news recently. He was a janitor at BC. All of his kids got to go to BC for free. So there are models that exist. And I knew some of the people who my parents worked with at Sears because they worked in retail. That's how their daughters and children got through was through working there and using that benefit through Boston College, and BU also had something similar. So if we do that here, that would be a complete game changer in terms of atonement. And BCBU, not so much on enslavement, but the slave trade, abolition, settler colonialism, that might be a way for them to think, but that's an existing benefit that exists. So what if we do that type of benefits at all these other institutions that have these histories? Using this model, I think you also get better retention, better town-gown relations, and a lot of things so people can live and work, but also for those families that were denied. They feel like, "Oh, now we can actually go. We can see what happened here."
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And to the listeners, who are listening right now, who are minds are blown, just hold that because it's a vision, right? That actually is a form of due reparations, right?
Mhm.
And what we could actually do besides just acknowledging
Yep.
and then doing a land acknowledgement or putting up a plaque. Like we can go
Mhm.
beyond that to actually repair the harm. Not fully repair, but it's some semblance of that. So before I ask you, and I always finish up with this very last question about what you hope your impact of your work is 10 years from now. Before that, I have to go here, right? Because being someone who does anti-racist work, I get calls and emails, folks checking on me, right? Because of this current political climate,
Mhm.
right? And my response is like, we've been here before, y'all, right? Just, yeah. And it does no good to freak out. This is where we are, right? But this is a moment in history. It's not the worst it's ever been, right? But yeah, I can't remember it being this bad. I'm like, what? Have you opened a history book? It's been like 10 times as bad. And so how do you help folks process what's currently happening nationally around this movement to eliminate, DEI and race-based admissions and just disassemble anything to do with equity work as a whole from the federal government? How do you help folks think about this?
One of the things I help them think about is saying, "We have been here before." People have developed local strategies and community structures. So I say, find your people, find the people you need for support, for self care purposes, because you're going to experience fatigue. Make sure you have a self care regime and the people to help you through this. and also to turn to African American history. And I'm going to use Black History Month as the perfect example. This was created at a time where African American history was mythologized intentionally by those who promoted white supremacy with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and even archives that would not even collect Black history other than to serve, saying how white Americans got their foundation through plantation records and the things. Carter G. Woodson did not wait for the nation to say we're going to celebrate Black history. He just did it.
Mhm.
And he created a week, he created an organization, he created a journal, he created other publishing arms. So for me, this year, one of the comments was came from the current president of the current manifestation of ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We don't need the president to give us anything. We just do, because Carter G. Woodson just created. So I think in the end, we can create our own freedom schools like were done in the 60s. We can create our own textbooks like have been done from the Civil War presence. We can create our own institutions and our own porch and community archives independent of what the state and the federal government's doing. And we have strategies from the past. And I think my book will help us get there to remind us these were ordinary people who did the same thing in the harshest of times. What can we learn from these individuals too? But they just kept on moving because they were concerned about 2, 3 generations of African American children and their holistic well-being as they matured into adulthood. We can still do that regardless of here. So I think it's community, local self-care, and learn from the past by the people who been marginalized before and still survived and persisted through all these times.
Thank you for that. That's definitely gonna be assured. Like, we have to be, be just keep stay vigilant. Like,
Mhm.
we've been here before.
Yep,
And I think I owe this to my ancestors that they were actually in physical mortal danger and they still did this work anyway. Right.
exactly.
I don't believe I'm in mortal danger or any physical danger, right? I might be, canceled every now and again online, but that's as far as it goes.
Amen.
Right. And so I think we've been here before. And like you said, we don't need permission. We just do, right? Because the problem doesn't change. And
Mhm.
so if you're thinking about your work, in your career up until now, but then, 20 years from now, and you have your sort of your canon of work that you put out there into the world, it's been absorbed, in the higher education, but also thinking about this in K-12, what do you hope your impact will be? Right. After 20, you want to look back and be like, wow, that was my impact in education because of my work. What do you hope your impact will be?
The 2 things, my work and its impact will be I always will reintroduce and recirculate the names and experiences of men, women, and children who have never been part of the canon, who always should have been in there. The ordinary people who were not leaders, but they made through their work and their living did extraordinary things. So how to bring them back into the narrative and how to find their voices, not just in the letters, but in the actions that they did and the work that they led and the communities that they changed. And the last thing I would hope my, legacy will be and my impact, I never do the conventional and what is expected of me, of the profession. I ask the questions because of sheer curiosity and seeing those absences, whether it's how did African Americans create and sustain schools after the Civil War, to who are the men and women who worked from enslavement to Jim Crow to the present on college and university campuses, to even the porch as a frame and understanding the other archival material we can do to understand the Civil War and how it gets remembered in these communities. That's, I think, my greatest legacy, and I hope my impact would be.
Thank you for the work that you do. I mean, I think it's super important. And of course, you're going to continue to do that for your personal reasons, but also to have an imprint in the world. And so if folks want more Dr. Green, right? I always like to put out there like where to find you. Like, are you on social media? Do you have like a podcast? Can they follow you with your different talks? Like, where do they find more of your work and how to follow you?
So I do have a personal website. I try to keep that up to date with my publications, but I am on Blue Sky now. I was on the former platform that is was Twitter, but I am no longer there. And I do post occasionally on Instagram, but if you want to see real me all the time, Blue Sky is where to find me.
All right, blue sky is where it is. So this has been another episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership the Institute Research and Practice podcast with Dr. Hilary Green. She's a James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College. Please pick up her newest book, Unforgettable Sacrifice, How Black Communities Remembered the Civil War. Thank you so much for coming on today, and I look forward to reading your work. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.